In the relentless cold of the Rocky Mountains, a lone mountain man faces the storm of a lifetime. Trapped by a month-long whiteout, his only hope of survival lies buried deep beneath the snow, a tunnel he crafted with his own hands. But survival isn't just about building, it's about outlasting the harshest winter the wilderness can throw at you. Before we dive into this incredible survival story, let us know where you're watching from. If you're moved by tales of wilderness ingenuity, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will push the limits of survival even further. The wind howled like an angry beast, its icy fingers ripping through the mountainside and sending sharp stabs of snow through the air. Thomas Gaines, huddled against the growing blizzard, looked out over the barren stretch of wilderness that had been his home for the past 7 winters. His cabin stood in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, but the walls of the little shelter he had built were no match for the fury that the storm was beginning to unleash. His fur-lined coat, though thick and well-worn, did little to shield him from the biting cold. His leather gloves, soaked with snow, barely retained any warmth. But he was used to this. He had spent years learning how to survive these brutal conditions, even if the winters always seemed to grow harsher. But this storm was different. Gaines had built his cabin with his own 2 hands, just like every other trapper who had come before him, but his was no ordinary shelter. Its logs were thick, the corners locked together by hand-hewn notches and covered in moss to keep the wind out. But it was only a matter of time before this storm tested its limits. The old shelter wasn't built to withstand the kind of snowdrifts this blizzard would bring. He had watched as the first flakes began to fall, the storm's promise making itself known in the stillness before it broke loose. As the hours passed, it became clear that this would not be a passing squall. This storm had teeth. The snow piled higher and higher, cutting off any chance of escape. His thoughts quickly turned to survival. He had enough food, enough supplies to last him through a few days, but those days would be too long if the storm didn't let up. In desperation, Gaines grabbed his axe and set off toward the far end of his cabin. He had no choice but to dig in literally. There was only one way out, and it would take all the strength he could muster to survive. The snow tunnel he had crafted over the years, hidden beneath layers of white and ice, was his only hope. With each strike of the axe, Gaines carved his way through the snow, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he worked relentlessly. For hours, he hacked at the snow, every swing of the axe taking him closer to what he hoped would be the only way out of his impending doom. His arms burned from the effort, but the thought of being trapped in that cabin, slowly, suffocating in the cold, was enough to keep him moving. At last, after what felt like an eternity, Gaines reached the end of the tunnel. He collapsed against the wall of snow, gasping for breath, his heart racing. But there was no time to rest. The storm was closing in, and if the tunnel collapsed before he could take refuge inside, he would have no escape. The wind screamed above him, but inside the snow tunnel, the world was eerily quiet. Gaines couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over him as he crawled deeper into the tunnel, pushing his body through the narrow, winding passage. The snow, packed tightly around him, provided a strange kind of insulation. It was an unnatural stillness, the only sound the rasp of his breath and the muffled thud of his boots against the frozen ground. The tunnel wasn't much, barely wide enough to crawl through without scraping his shoulders against the icy walls, but it was a life-saving refuge he had spent years perfecting. It was his secret, the one thing that had kept him alive through the worst storms of his time in the mountains. A man could survive for days in the snow if he knew where to dig and how to build. Every few feet, Gaines had to stop and adjust his position, his shoulders aching from the effort of crawling through the tight space. The walls of snow scraped against his clothing, his fur coat trailing behind him like a heavy burden. He had been in this situation before, but never with the stakes this high. If the storm didn't let up soon, he might be trapped here for weeks. His mind raced as he thought about the storm, the cabin, and what he had left behind. But there was no time for regrets now. He had made it to the tunnel, and that meant he had a chance, however slim, to survive. The small opening at the end of the tunnel was his lifeline, but even that felt fragile. He needed to make it through the next few days, maybe weeks, until the storm passed, and until then, there would be no room for weakness. As he crawled deeper into the snow tunnel, His mind began to wander back to how he had built it in the first place. It wasn't just about digging a hole and hoping for the best. It had taken years of trial and error, every winter spent perfecting the technique, learning how the snow settled, what angles to dig, and how deep he needed to go to withstand the heaviest snowdrifts. The tunnel was as much a product of his will to survive as it was of the harsh wilderness that surrounded him. He thought about how he had learned to live with the land, how survival had become second nature. The mountains had taken much from him, his friends, his partners, and even parts of his soul, but they had also given him the strength to endure. And now, as he pressed forward, the tunnel seemed to be the embodiment of that strength. At times, his thoughts would drift to memories of the people he had known, trappers who hadn't made it, partners who had disappeared into the wilderness without a trace. But for all the loss, Gaines had learned one thing: survival was never guaranteed. It was a constant fight, one that required every ounce of strength and willpower a man had left. And as the storm continued to rage above, Gaines kept crawling through the snow tunnel, his heart steady with the realization that he would outlast the storm. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to believe that he might just make it through this one. The world outside had turned into a ghostly blur of white. The storm raged on, unfurling its fury without mercy. The wind had shifted, creating gusts that howled through the trees, rattling the cabin in the distance. Inside the snow tunnel, Thomas Gaines could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The snowflakes had begun to fall even heavier, and though his body was warm, his mind was cold with the realization that survival was going to demand everything he had. The tunnel, narrow as it was, had been a lifesaver so far, offering a sliver of hope against the fury of nature. But it was also an unspoken reminder of how vulnerable he truly was. He could hear the wind above, as though the world itself was trying to tear everything down, and it made him feel small. Here, buried in the earth, surrounded by solid walls of snow, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer the tunnel would hold. The pressure of the storm would eventually turn the snow into something more than just ice and air. It would become a force of its own, and that force had a way of collapsing what humans thought they had mastered. Gaines tried to steady his breathing as he inched forward, the tunnel stretching out before him like a long, uncertain path. He knew from experience that if the storm didn't let up soon, his only refuge would be the shelter of the tunnel until the worst passed. But no matter how much he moved, it seemed like the tunnel never grew shorter. Every foot felt like a mile, and every breath felt more strained than the last. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it creeping in, even through his thick coat. The fur had been his lifeline on the worst days, but now, trapped beneath layers of snow, even it felt like it wasn't enough. He had spent too many winters alone in the mountains to allow himself the luxury of panic, but every now and then, a deep unease would grip his chest, and he'd be reminded that the wilderness didn't care about survival, it cared about endurance. His thoughts flickered to the years he had spent learning the art of survival, how to build shelters, how to trap, and how to handle the harshest of conditions. His methods had kept him alive in the past, but this storm was different. This was a full-on assault, not just on his body, but on his mind, too. He had always been a man who relied on his instincts, but this time, instincts weren't enough. He was going to have to dig deeper, deeper than the tunnel, deeper than the surface. With every minute that passed, the snow continued to fall, relentless and cold. He had hoped for a break in the storm, but now all he could hear was the howling wind and the eerie silence of the snow around him. Time seemed to stretch in the dark of the tunnel, every second slipping by like the snow that encased him. Yet, in this small, insulated world, his thoughts were clearer than ever. He had come to understand one truth. Out here, in the white silence, survival wasn't just about the elements. It was about conquering the fear that crept in at night, the loneliness that gnawed at the soul when you were forced to be alone with nothing but your thoughts and the storm. And so, he pressed forward, deeper into the tunnel, his hands raw from the strain, his mind focused only on one thing: getting through this. Days bled into one another in a blur of snow and cold. The blizzard showed no signs of letting up, its rage unrelenting, as if determined to strip the world bare of hope. But Thomas Gaines had no intention of being a casualty of nature. He had fought the wilderness for years, and now, trapped in his snow tunnel, he would fight it once more. There was something else, though, something gnawing at the edges of his resolve. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving something to himself. The storm wasn't just testing his physical endurance, it was testing the strength of his spirit. In the quiet of the tunnel, surrounded by the thick snow and the icy darkness, the cold seemed to reach into his bones and settle in his chest. The mental strain was worse than the physical one. He was used to hardship, used to the solitude, but now that his world had narrowed down to this small space, the isolation seemed to amplify. His thoughts swirled, each one louder than the last, threatening to consume him. The world outside, filled with its constant white noise, seemed distant. Here, in this frozen solitude, he was alone. The tunnel, now a sanctuary, had also become a prison. He had to keep moving, inching forward through the thick snow, one slow, careful step after the other. Each movement reminded him of how fragile his situation was. He had no idea how long the storm would last. He had no idea how much longer the tunnel would hold. Every now and then he could hear the soft creaking of the snow above him, and it sent a shiver down his spine. How much weight could this fragile tunnel hold? His fingers were stiff, the cold creeping into every joint as he continued his slow crawl. His boots, caked in snow and ice, scraped against the tunnel floor, adding a rhythmic sound to the otherwise oppressive silence. Time had lost its meaning in the tunnel. He had no way of knowing if it had been hours or days since he had last seen the faintest light from the outside world. It didn't matter. The storm had taken that from him, and now the fight was within. The fight was to stay strong, to hold on to whatever hope remained, however small it was. Gaines had learned that survival wasn't just about fighting the elements, it was about fighting your own fear, fear that the next step could be your last. Fear that the storm would never end, and you would be trapped forever. But somewhere deep inside, he found a small flame of resolve. He would not give in. He had lived for this moment, the moment where the storm wasn't just a force of nature but a test of the heart. Hours blurred into the next. His body screamed for rest, but his mind pushed him on. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was this close. Not when survival was just inches away. The snow tunnel stretched endlessly in front of him, but each step brought him closer to something: hope, survival, and maybe, in the end, a kind of victory. The storm may have been fierce, but he had learned one thing. It couldn't conquer the human spirit. So he kept moving, pushing forward, knowing that as long as he kept crawling, he would survive. The tunnel might be small, but it was enough. For now, it was all he needed. The storm had not relented. The wind howled above, like a beast caged in the mountains, each gust shaking the snow-covered trees and sending plumes of powder drifting through the air. But inside the snow tunnel, Thomas Gaines felt the weight of something different, the crushing pressure of time. The storm's howls were constant, but so was the stillness that surrounded him in the tunnel. His body had grown weary from the constant crawling, each inch a battle against the cold and fatigue. His fur coat, once a reliable shield, felt heavier with each movement. It wasn't just the physical toll that was draining him now, it was the mental exhaustion. He had spent years in these mountains, learning how to survive the harshest winters. But this felt different. The storm was relentless, and even his hardened will was beginning to waver. Each day, if it could even be called a day in the endless whiteout, felt like an eternity. The cold gnawed at him, not just from the outside, but from within, as his thoughts spiraled. He began to wonder if he would ever see the sun again. His legs burned, every muscle aching from the hours of crawling. He had no choice but to keep moving, to keep pushing himself further into the tunnel. His mind swam with memories of past winters, of fires burning bright inside his cabin, of food simmering in a pot. Those memories felt distant now, like echoes of a life long gone. He had survived the wilderness before, but this time it felt like the wilderness was winning. As the storm raged on, Gaines found himself questioning his decisions. Should he have dug deeper? Should he have reinforced the tunnel more? The weight of doubt settled heavily on his chest, mixing with the physical exhaustion that threatened to overcome him. But then, as if on cue, the wind howled louder, pushing through the tunnel's entrance with a fierce gust. He tightened his grip on the walls of snow, forcing himself forward. Despite the cold, despite the doubt, the mountain had not defeated him yet. He would keep moving, because the alternative was to give in to despair. The snow had not stopped falling, but Gaines could feel a shift in the atmosphere. His body, though exhausted, had begun to adapt to the cold, to the rhythm of crawling through the snow. It was no longer a battle to survive each inch. Now, it was a matter of maintaining a steady pace. He had settled into a strange kind of rhythm within the tunnel, his movements mechanical, each drag of his body a small victory against the elements above. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to think about something other than the storm. His mind wandered back to the time he spent building the tunnel, how he had carefully calculated every step of its construction. Each curve, each turn, was deliberate. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a lifeline, a symbol of his ability to survive in a place that would swallow most men whole. The tunnel had been an idea born out of desperation, born from the fear of being trapped, of losing everything to the wilderness. But it had become more than that. It had become a testament to his resourcefulness, his determination to live when every instinct told him to give up. As he crawled forward, his breath steady and slow, Gaines realized that the tunnel was not just a physical structure, it was a metaphor for his own survival. The passage through the snow was long and treacherous, but it was his path forward, his way out of the storm's grip. He could hear the wind howling above him, but it felt distant now. The tunnel was a shield, protecting him from the worst of it. And for the first time since he had entered, the thought of survival felt real again. The storm raged outside, but inside the tunnel there was a stillness, a peace that allowed him to think clearly. He was no longer just surviving, he was enduring. Every inch he moved, every foot of snow he passed through, was a step closer to making it through. The tunnel, once a simple means of escape, had become his sanctuary, a promise that, if he could hold on just a little longer, he would make it out. Gaines had long lost track of the days. The storm's howls had become an omnipresent force, a constant barrage of wind and snow that refused to relent. His body had grown accustomed to the discomfort of the snow tunnel, the cramped space where every movement felt like a struggle. The tightness in his muscles from the constant crawling had become a dull ache that pulsed through his arms and legs. His hands were raw, blistered from gripping the icy walls of the tunnel, but he could feel them slowly becoming numb, like the rest of his body, as if the cold was claiming every part of him, bit by bit. The stillness inside the tunnel was deceptive. Though the wind raged above him, inside there was a haunting quiet. The kind of silence that made every breath feel louder, every shift in his body more significant. But the storm wasn't what had him tense now. It was something else. Something primal, something deep in his gut, that told him that the storm was coming to a head. He could feel it in the air, the shift in the pressure. The world outside was holding its breath. Every movement felt harder now. His energy was nearly spent. He had thought the worst was behind him, but now the realization gripped him with chilling clarity. The storm was not just a passing inconvenience, it was a force that could break even the strongest of men. But there was no quitting now. He had made it this far. Through the cold, through the isolation, through the doubts, he would see it through to the end. The tunnel, once a place of safety, now felt like a trap. As much as it had offered refuge, it also held him in its grip, a reminder of just how fragile his position was. The snow that had once been comforting like a solid, unyielding barrier now felt like it was closing in. The walls seemed to press in on him with every crawl forward. He had reached the furthest point of the tunnel, and there was no more room to go but forward. If the storm didn't let up, if it didn't ease its grip on the mountains soon, he might find himself buried in this tomb of snow, a forgotten soul in a land that cared for none. Despite the danger, despite the fear that gripped his chest, Gaines couldn't help but feel a faint flicker of hope. The storm had taken everything: his cabin, his partners, his peace, but it had not taken his will to survive. It had forced him to reckon with his limits, to face the depths of his fear. And now, at the edge of his endurance, he found that he was still standing, still breathing. He had fought through every obstacle the mountains had thrown at him, and he would fight through this storm too. The wind howled above him, louder now, as if mocking him, taunting him for thinking he could survive it. But Gaines clenched his fists, his frozen fingers biting into the walls of snow, and pressed forward. He wasn't finished yet. Not yet. The storm's fury seemed endless. The wind continued its ceaseless howling above, and the snow was thick and heavy, as if the mountain itself was trying to bury him. But inside the snow tunnel, everything had slowed. The space around him felt more cramped than it had before, and the air was thinner. His breath came in shallow bursts as he pushed himself forward. Each movement felt like it took everything he had left. But there was no turning back now. He had come too far. His survival wasn't just about escaping the snow, it was about pushing through, past the storm's rage, to the other side. And then, suddenly, there was a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the wind, the way it seemed to lose some of its bite. The snow, too, had lightened, its furious descent lessened, as if the mountain was beginning to let go of its fury. Gaines paused for a moment, allowing himself to catch his breath, his frozen body aching with the effort. For the first time in what felt like forever, the storm seemed to be losing its grip. He had to fight the urge to rush out of the tunnel, to see the world beyond. He had spent so long in the cold, in the dark, that the thought of sunlight or even just an open sky was almost too much to bear. But he knew he had to remain patient. The storm had fooled him once before, making him think it was over when it wasn't. He couldn't afford to make that mistake again. As he waited, still, in the growing quiet, a part of him began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had outlasted it. That the worst of the storm had passed, and the wilderness had finally yielded to his will. For all the suffering, for all the struggles he had endured in the past weeks, the cold, the isolation, the hunger, the fear, it felt like it had been worth it. He had made it. He had survived. Then, as the storm began to break, the first rays of light broke through the snow-drenched skies above. The light was faint at first, barely visible through the thick clouds and mist, but it was enough to give him the hope he had been clinging to for so long. The tunnel, his refuge, had kept him alive, but it was the storm's end that would mark the beginning of his survival. With one last deep breath, Gaines moved forward, crawling slowly toward the light. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The storm might have taken everything from him, but it had failed to take his will to live. And now, as the snow drifted away and the air began to warm, he knew one thing for certain: he was going to make it. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the snowstorm, pale and weak, like the hand of fate offering a sliver of hope. The winds had calmed significantly, and the once howling beast of a blizzard now felt like a tired whisper in the distance. Gaines crawled slowly through the snow tunnel, inching his way toward the end. His limbs were stiff, sore, from days of crawling, and his mind clouded by exhaustion. He hadn't seen the sky in weeks, not properly, not without the thick veil of snow blocking his view. But now, that small sliver of light at the end of the tunnel wasn't just a dream, it was real. The snow had become less dense. The wind, once a constant threat, now seemed muted, as though the mountain had exhausted itself. The sense of dread that had weighed him down for days seemed to lift with the quieting storm. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world outside didn't seem so hostile. Gaines pulled himself through the last few feet of the tunnel, the cramped space now feeling suffocating as he emerged from the cold, icy depths into the open air. He took a deep, labored breath, feeling the bitter chill of the mountain's breath against his skin, the air filling his lungs like a shock to his system. It was raw, unfiltered, and real. It felt like freedom. The world outside was a wasteland of white. Snow had blanketed everything, a thick layer that covered the earth, the trees, and the scattered remnants of what had been the edge of the storm. The landscape, once a familiar territory, now looked alien, untouched, as if the world itself had been wiped clean. Gaines stood shakily, his body protesting the movement after so many days of confinement in the snow tunnel. His legs wobbled beneath him, unused to standing. But the stillness of the world, the silence that only snow could bring, offered a kind of solace he hadn't expected. He had made it. The storm, the mountain, all of it he had survived. His eyes scanned the horizon. It was a desolate beauty, the vast expanse of snow stretching endlessly before him. He could see the remnants of trees swaying gently, their branches weighed down by the heavy snow. The light of the early morning reflected off the snow, giving everything a ghostly, almost ethereal glow. It was a new world, one that was harsh, but one that still allowed life to thrive in its own way. For a moment, Gaines felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The wilderness had tested him, had pushed him to the brink of his endurance, but it had also given him the strength to survive. He had built the tunnel with his own hands, dug his way out from the depths of despair, and here he stood, on the edge of that wilderness, alive. But there was no time to linger in the quiet peace of survival. As the storm continued to retreat into the mountains, Gaines knew that he had to move. There were no guarantees. The storm might have passed, but the world would never be easy. He had to find shelter, food, and water. He had to find his next step in this wilderness that seemed so vast and unforgiving. With a heavy breath, Gaines began his trek through the snow. The landscape felt both like a familiar enemy and a long-lost friend. He knew the mountains better than most, but they had taken so much from him. Now, they would become his challenge once again. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't crawling anymore. He was walking, moving forward with purpose. He wasn't just surviving, he was going to live. The mountains, quiet and serene now, held an eerie stillness in the aftermath of the storm. The storm clouds had finally dissipated, leaving the wilderness bathed in the soft golden light of a new day. It wasn't just the weather that had cleared, it was something deeper, something more profound. Thomas Gaines had outlasted the worst of the storm, and with each passing moment he could feel the weight of his journey lifting. He had emerged from the snow tunnel, the very symbol of his fight against nature, and now, standing in the crisp air, he felt a connection to the land that he hadn't felt before. It was as if the wilderness had whispered its approval, as if it recognized his struggle and had granted him a second chance, but there were no guarantees. The mountain was beautiful in its silence, but it was also a place that could turn deadly without warning. As he trudged through the deep snow, the solitude was both a comfort and a challenge. He was alone, as he had always been. But now, he no longer felt isolated. The storm had stripped him of his fears, forced him to face every doubt, every weakness, and in doing so, it had made him stronger. He knew that survival out here wasn't just about enduring the elements. It was about the choices you made. It was about finding hope, even when the world seemed to be against you. He had lost so much: his cabin, his partners, the dreams he had held on to. But the wilderness had also given him something invaluable: resilience. He had crafted his own escape from the storm, built a tunnel of survival that had been his refuge, and now, as he stood against the backdrop of the mountains, he could feel the lessons he had learned echo through every inch of his body. For the first time, Gaines felt as though he was at peace, not because the struggle was over, but because he had learned something deep within himself. The wilderness didn't make promises, and it didn't show mercy, it simply was. And in that truth, Gaines had found a new sense of purpose. He had become a part of the landscape, not a conqueror of it, but a survivor within it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the snowy earth beneath his feet, he knew that the mountains would always be his home. It was a place of constant challenge, but it was also the place where he had come to understand who he truly was. A man who could build something out of nothing, a man who could endure, a man who would survive. And though the wilderness would continue to change, to test him in ways he could never predict, he would always be ready. Because the wilderness didn't just take lives, it also gave them back.